Good morning, everybody. Thank you all very much for joining us today for the first part of our two-part webinar series on unlocking energy flexibility at scale. Today, we'll be discussing an open ecosystem and whole system approach to flexibility market platforms. But just before we get started, just some brief housekeeping. Today's session is recorded, so we'll be sending it around after the session ends. It will last around 30 or so minutes. And the Q&A function, it is available throughout the session. So if you have any questions, pop them in there and we'll try and answer them at the end. If we don't have time to answer them, we'll follow up after the webinar. So great, just on to some introductions. If we can have the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So I'm Suzy Lycett, I'm Content Manager at Electron. I'll be your host for today's session. And I'll pass over to Chris and Simon just to introduce themselves and then tell you a little bit about Electron and Arup.
Yeah, thanks, Suzy. Morning, everybody. I'm Chris Broadhurst. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Electron, so look after our sales and marketing globally. And Electron has a flexibility market platform, so we help distribution system operators and flex providers interact and trade flexibility in the network. Over to you, Simon.
I'm Simon Evans, the Global Digital Energy Leader here at Arup, which means I look after how we can use digital technologies to enhance and enable the work that Arup do in the energy sector, but also our contribution more broadly to the sector's digitalization, which we'll be touching on in a little bit in the webinar. And if you don't know Arup, we are a large multidisciplinary engineering consultancy company working across most of the built and natural environment, and of course, including energy.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much. Just on to today's agenda. So we've got three main points to run through. The first is what is an open ecosystem versus a monolithic approach to flexibility, just some definitions there. We'll then move on to how can an open ecosystem approach to flex markets help unlock flexibility at scale. And then we'll move on to how does whole system oversight enable the open ecosystem. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Chris just to kick off and explain what an open ecosystem approach to flexibility is.
Thanks, Suzy. Yeah, so I guess before we dive into some of the detail, worth just starting with some basic definitions, really. What do we mean by open ecosystem and what's the alternative? So open ecosystem, there's basically two parts to this. I'll start with the last part first, keep things interesting. So the ecosystem part means this interconnected system with different participants. It could be companies, individuals, government, etc. And they're collaborating, exchanging information, interacting with one another. And they're doing that for some form of mutual benefit. And a really obvious and live example of that is the internet. We're using it right now. We're building on top of these shared open protocols and standards. And applications like Zoom exist so that we can talk over the internet. The other element to open ecosystem is open. So this means that the infrastructure that supports the system is shared and accessible to all. Again, thinking of the internet, HTTP and FTP, all these protocols are accessible and publicly available. And that means everyone can interact and share information in a very standardized and publicly accessible way. So when we say open ecosystem, we're talking about this interconnected system, interoperable system that's accessible. And so before we dive into the examples of what that means for low carbon flexibility, just a brief bit on what the alternative is. So this would be a monolithic system, one where all the parts are controlled and operated by one single entity or company, and where transparency in how the system works or access to the data within it is limited. And this does obviously make sense if you've got super secure applications or use cases. It makes sense to have a fairly closed system, but there are drawbacks with interoperability and access to data. So that's the context and backdrop. That's what we mean when we say open ecosystem. So if we think about flexibility, there's a lot of debate going on at the moment in the UK and in Europe around this topic. How do we unlock flexibility at scale? And often that's centering around who should be building certain parts of the system, who should own that specific API, and who should be responsible for running that specific data service. And these are all really valid questions. And there's lots of work underway in the UK and Europe to solve for those and to put those building blocks in place. But we wanted to today, and on an ongoing basis, really continue to put a spotlight on something that we think is as important, if not more important, and that's the shared digital infrastructure on which these services can be built. So it does matter who builds and runs these services in the ecosystem, but it absolutely matters who and how we're building on that system. So who owns the data is a good question, but is that data open and accessible, and can it be portable and moved from system to system? And without that open ecosystem, we will end up with some walled gardens where data gets stuck, it ends up in silos, and that's going to really halt or slow down progress as it becomes more and more difficult to interact with one another in the system and to access that data. So that's the scene set, I guess. There's a huge opportunity as we move through the energy transition to deliver this at pace and to deliver this at the lowest cost. But we think a really key building block to that foundational layer is an open ecosystem that can allow for that competition and innovation to happen and to avoid these walled gardens. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll talk now specifically about how it can help flexibility. And there's a few perspectives to this, many players in the ecosystem. But if we just think about the system operators, so the DSOs and the ESOs, the regional and national system operators, and the flexibility providers, the aggregators and asset owners who can provide flexibility into the system, and then the end consumer. Thinking of those as the three key stakeholders that we'll talk about and who can benefit from this approach. And it's worth as well, before getting into the detail, reminding ourselves of that problem statement. How do we unlock flexibility at scale? That is really the question to answer. And from our perspective, we think there's basically just two levers to pull to do that. And that's how do we get more volume of flexibility, and how do we make that flexibility more valuable? So that volume and value question. So as we go through this, I'll be trying to bring this back to how does an open ecosystem help a DSO attract more volume, or how does it help a flex provider get more value out of flexibility? I think as long as we're coming back to that problem statement, unlocking flex at scale and answering those questions, how is it bringing more volume? How is it creating more value? We know we're heading in the right direction. So starting with system operators, the DSO, the ESO, how can an open ecosystem help, and how can it enable flexibility at scale? So if we look at the first part of the question, that volume question, one of the ways an open ecosystem can help attract more volume is to create more opportunities for flexibility providers. But today there's probably fairly limited visibility of these opportunities and a lack of coordination between different opportunities, and that can be within a DSO's own markets that it's running, its own products that it's putting out, but also between DSOs and ESO. And that lack of standardization in the underlying data about the assets that are taking part, the products and the markets that are being traded, and so on, that's where the friction is created, and that's impairing the system operator's ability to create more opportunities that are visible to flex providers. And Simon will touch later on how we can use data and standardization of data to solve for that. But where an open ecosystem can help is around the operational efficiency. So there are downstream problems with this lack of data standardization, a lack of interoperability between systems within a DSO and between DSOs and ESO, which just creates a lot of friction for the market operators and friction for the flex providers, which just creates another barrier to entry. So if we think about how can an open ecosystem help, it's solving for those friction points of friction in the user journey for market operators who are trying to create more volume of flex, and for the providers of flexibility who are trying to access and have visibility of those flexible opportunities. So then if we think about how does it make it more valuable, it's kind of linked to the first point. For system operators, if we can make it more efficient to create and launch more market opportunities for flexibility, then we're not just increasing the volume of flexibility by being able to run more varied opportunities, but we're also improving the unit economics of flexibility itself. It's easier, takes less effort to launch and operate and scale flexibility markets if we're working on this more standardized open ecosystem where data can move more freely, there's more choice for DSOs. And then thinking about flex providers, then moving on to the second type of stakeholder. So just like DSOs, they're on the other side of that equation where there are a lot of barriers today in taking part in flexibility markets for the same reasons, that the data isn't standardized. There's a reliance on spreadsheets and repetitive data entry as a result, lots of manual workarounds, and often a fallback to phone calls and emails and spreadsheets because there isn't that standardized open interface to interact with. So that makes it costly and time intensive to take part, so drives the cost of participation up. And it also creates a fairly high barrier to entry. So smaller resources, particularly on the consumer level, are going to find it difficult to take part unless it becomes a lot cheaper and easier at a very low level to do that. And DSOs increasingly do want to access volume at the lower voltage levels of the network. So it has to become easier, cheaper, faster to access Flex. And that's why we need to get those standards and open protocols in place. And the other angle as well, often less talked about, is that this open ecosystem will promote competition and innovation between providers like us, Electron, who are trying to deliver a market platform where these transactions can take place. So we're really incentivized in this competitive environment to deliver the best possible experience for flex providers and for market operators. So it becomes our job to strip out that complexity and remove those points of friction, continuously improve it. And that becomes really important as we think about the long-term benefits of low carbon flexibility and how that impacts the end consumer, which is the last kind of stakeholder and the most important group in a way. How does this benefit us as end consumers? And if we're fostering this innovation and competition, allowing multiple providers to exist and interact without sacrificing the quality of data or introducing too much friction in the data, we can ensure that we're always going to be pushing for the fastest, lowest cost and best experience for providers of Flex and for market operators, which means we can then deliver the lowest cost net zero as fast as possible. So talked about what an open ecosystem is and how this can benefit flexibility, but definitely from a market platform perspective and a DSO and FSP perspective. Wanted to hand over to Simon now, who can talk about the whole system and how that relates to the flexibility.
Brilliant, thanks, Chris. And really iterating what's just been shared there, that we absolutely need a whole system and really a collaborative approach to make this happen. And I guess the part about that is that reducing the barriers and friction of data sharing at scale, by which I mean machine-to-machine integration, not just emailing files to each other, and in a secure and a resilient way, which is security-minded at its core, especially as we're starting to venture into critical national infrastructure here, will be fundamentally required in order for us to get this to this point of where we need to go. And it will require a shared and sector-wide approach in order to do so. And by this, what I mean is that we need to be able to work together to put in place the minimum and thinnest possible technology, process, and governance that could be deployed across the sector consistently. And this is very much a decentralized model in nature. So again, not just a monolithic or giant platform. It needs to be open by default, so open source with no risk of vendor lock-in and the associated hurdle costs that will come with that. And we need to be able to create that marketplace for services and innovation to flourish, so not just cannibalize that as such. And naturally address not just flexibility use cases, but all energy sector use cases that will potentially come about. Now, for me, a key part of this is that it's not just a technical problem, it's very much a socio-technical problem. And when I say technical, of course, that's things like ontologies, taxonomies, data standards, hardware, which is often the area of focus when it comes to these type of conversations. But arguably, it's the area that we've got the most certainty because much of web tech exists, and this is kind of just a replication of that. But for me, it's very much the socio side, by which I mean the policy, regulatory, procurement, and also things like legal skills, importantly, and change management that will need much more of the focus than the other areas. And if we focus on these together in duality, that socio-technical approach, we can very much drive towards a much more whole system and open ecosystem approach, which very much has to be grounded in the need for interoperability and that kind of exchange of information between various actors. And of course, the realization that it's about a constellation of technologies coming together And there's no single person, single platform that can provide this. It's always going to be loads of them working together with that interoperability to bring success, as Chris was saying. Of course, the objective in all this is to make all data potentially shareable, but of course, that doesn't necessarily mean it's all shared. And again, that's because we need to be security minded in our approach here, making sure the right data is shared with the right actors to allow better decisions to be made faster. Again, making all data shareable, potentially, but not necessarily shared. And of course, we're not the only people talking about this conversation. Of course, there's many other conversations happening across the sector, both within energy, but also cross-sectorally as well. And I think it's really key that those type of programs, initiatives come together and are all working together to pull in the same common direction. I've listed a few on screen here of particular interest, all of which are actually actively collaborating and connecting in some capacity, helping us bring convergence to this rather complex space rather than divergence. And if I was to call them out, we've of course got the first one here of the National Digital Twin Programme, which is looking to create that ecosystem of connected digital twins across all economic infrastructure, so very much cross-sectorally. And then the linked part for us here in the energy sector that you might have seen getting quite a lot of significant traction most recently, particularly on the outcomes of the digital spine feasibility study, is this idea of a data sharing infrastructure, which is very much being pushed and led as well at the moment by the Virtual Energy System Programme that ESO are partaking. And this is about creating that energy sector component of the national vision that's being put forward by the National Digital Twin Programme. And indeed, the data sharing infrastructure work by ESO and the National Digital Twin Programme recently signed an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, to collaborate together to see how we can bring success in the sector, which I think is a really, really exciting move. Such large programmes come together for a common good. And then, of course, bringing it closer to home, we have Flexibility Markets Unlocked, which is an ongoing competition being run by DESNZ at the moment to help enable flexibility at scale across the sector. And it's a project that Arup, Electron and the Energy Systems Catapult are working together on alongside a couple of other competition partners. And we'll be talking about that in more detail in the next webinar. But I think for me, the key thing and the key frame to leave this audience is this term: collaborate on the rules, compete on the game. And I feel that mantra very much applies to what we're trying to achieve here. That if we as the sector can collaborate on the rules, and that is what are the common definitions, the common principles, the things between us that will actually enable that market to flourish, then each of us can compete on the resulting game based on our own commercial interests and drivers. As fundamentally, there is enough pie here for everyone to eat, and it shouldn't be about individuals trying to create fiefdoms or castles. If we aren't collaborating on the rules and then obviously competing on the resulting game, we're never going to achieve what we need to in order to unlock the flexibility and get to our net zero transition. So that's all I wanted to share at this moment. So I'll hand back to you, Chris.
Yeah, I guess just chipping in on that. So we think about this a lot at Electron. We don't have all the answers, and we're, like everyone else in the space, facing into a lot of, I guess, uncertainty about how this is going to unfold. Naturally, particularly in an ecosystem where there's lots of moving parts and we've all got different commercial interests, it's hard to guess where we're all going to go. But as long as we've got the governance, we have a good sense of the direction. I guess something we think about is how can we build a great product and remove friction for DSOs and improve the experience for FSPs in the face of all that change. What choices can we make as we build our platform to ensure that we're remaining adaptable and flexible in the way that the product and technology is built? So it's going to be a separate webinar that Nick, our head of products, can talk to in more detail. But just to say that there are ways we think you can build technology in an ecosystem that's evolving. That means you're not waiting for something to happen. You're not waiting for it to be figured out in a year or in 3 months' time. We can make choices now about the things that are in our control, the markets that we're running, how we configure the product, but making sure that the edges are adaptable and open to these different potential new data streams. It is why we're working so closely with Arup and DESNZ to figure out what might those standard data protocols look like, and how can we build the edges of our platform to be ready for that. So just to say, I guess from a market perspective, we think this is a really great development that we can build towards standardization, but we're not standing still and waiting for that to complete. And we'd encourage everybody to take that same approach, thinking about how can you make two-way door decisions in the things that you're buying or building, so that if things change, you can go back through the door and take a different angle or take a different approach. So just to give you that kind of product perspective, we're trying to build that adaptability into the platform so that we continue to evolve with the market as it progresses.
So you start by starting rather than staying still.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, we've had a couple of questions through, and I think we've got some time just to answer at least one of them. So the first one that cropped up is, isn't there a risk that if we dilute the ownership or break this up too much, that could slow the rate of progress? So could this potentially make it more complicated? I don't know who wants to answer this first. Maybe Chris, if I throw it out to you.
Yeah, then maybe Simon could give the whole system perspective. So it's definitely a risk in a complex, with any complex system and with anything evolving as fast as this space is. There is a risk that if you break things up into smaller pieces, that they can become uncoordinated. But that's why we're pushing for this open ecosystem and pushing for standardization. I think that mantra Simon said, collaborate on the rules. If we can agree what those standards should look like and what that common data set should look like and how we should communicate with each other, then we can be more confident that we're all going in the same direction and working on similar rules. And so we think this open ecosystem approach is a way of solving that or addressing that risk that without governance and standards and open protocols, it absolutely could completely unravel and we'll end up with just many more silos. But if we can ensure that data can move freely between systems and that each of the participants can interoperate and integrate with each other, we're solving for that problem. But the key is standardization underneath. We have to have that foundation, and that needs to be a common shared digital infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I completely agree with that. And I think the interesting part here that we've observed, and going back to my comment earlier on it being a socio-technical challenge, and Chris just mentioned then on governance, that breaking this problem up into different parts, it does create a potential risk of feeling like it goes slower. And it's easy with many of these things, particularly if you were to put roadmaps on screen for people to either criticize and say it's going too fast or it's going too slow. I would kind of counter that and put up a thought saying that actually the biggest blocker here isn't how fast you can build tech, how fast you can align around things, it's actually the politics and the people that go with it. And that's never a single person conversation. You need to have everyone involved in the conversation, moving in the same direction. So an idea of collaborating on the rules, competing on the game, we're going to go much further if we do this collectively together, but appreciating we are all different entities and have all our own different drivers. So it's a necessary part of the process. If we look at also how we've had success in other sectors outside of energy where they've gone through similar journeys, they've modeled the same thing. And whilst they've had barriers and challenges, it also ultimately has resulted in a end better solution for the sector.
Thank you. And just the other question that you've had through, so aren't people already doing this already through various initiatives? Is this approach possibly a duplication, would you say? I'll go to Simon first this time.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And again, it's because many of these things on a surface level sound like they're similar. It sounds like there's risk of them duplicating or causing friction with each other. But as I kind of shared in my narrative earlier, there are a number of programs that are more prevalent given their size or scale or actors involved that are really pushing forward in this. And those are all actively collaborating and making sure that there is connectivity between them and that they are working in a Venn diagram point of view, by complementing each other where possible, but also playing in different areas where they're not necessarily competing with their own timelines and roadmaps. So yes, there are other things happening, but I think the key thing here is that it's on us as a sector to again try and pull the threads together. And Electron, Arup, and Energy Systems Catapult are involved in some of that, as are many of the actors, and indeed I can see many of the attendees who have joined us today involved in helping pull those threads together. So yes, I think we have risk of that, similar to the first question, but again, I'm confident we can mitigate it by just, dare I say it, collaborating on the rules, competing on the game.
Fantastic, thank you. Chris, I don't know whether you have anything to add to that or whether we'll move on to the next section.
No, I think it might be a segue to the next section anyway, but just that this is a very live discussion and we're really keen to collaborate with everybody in the space to get the right answers. So if you're listening in and you're a DSO or an FSP or a consumer and you have ideas or questions or challenges to this approach, we'd love to hear from you and talk it through. We're actively involved in a number of these discussions through the work we're doing with Arup and Energy Systems Catapult and through DESNZ, but in Europe as well. So there's plenty of forums to get your voice heard. So if you if what we're saying today is resonating with you, or you have some sort of allergic reaction to it, we'd love to hear either way, because we need to have that discussion and debate openly about what the right approach to take is.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. If we could just move on to the next slide. Thank you. So thank you, Simon and Chris. Obviously, that brings the first part of our webinar series to a close. The second part will take place on the 7th of March at 10 a.m. We'll be joined by Nick Humpbatch, Head of Product at Electron, and Dave Evans, Senior Digital and Data Consultant at Energy Systems Catapult. They'll discuss what to consider when building the digital tools for flex marketplaces, obviously in the context of everything that we've discussed today as well. So we'll share the link for you to sign up to that session in the follow-up email, along with a recording of today's session and our just launched white paper, which obviously delves into all the topics we've discussed today in just a bit more detail. So just onto the final slide to say thank you again for all of your time. We'll be at the Distributed Energy Show in March. So if you're there, we'd obviously love to meet up with you. We'll be at stand 5031. But obviously, if you'd like to jump on a call before then or book in some time specifically to chat with us there, then you can scan this QR code and we'll be in touch. But I think that's all from us for today. So thank you very much, and have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.